So hello, today's practical, which is related to aperture priority and shutter priority, is the next step from what we did last week, where we were just using the camera in a fully automatic mode. So the beauty and advantage of using a DSLR camera is that you can control the aperture, which is the size of the diaphragm, and controls the volume of light that's entering the camera. And you can also control the shutter speed, or how long that shutter is allowed to remain open before it closes again. So, as we mentioned in the lecture, when you select aperture priority, you are now controlling the aperture of the camera and allowing the camera computer to compensate and create and set the reciprocal shutter speed to go with that aperture that you've selected to get what the camera believes to be the most appropriate exposure. Likewise with the shutter priority, when you select the shutter speed, the camera functionality will select what it considers to be the most appropriate corresponding aperture to go with that shutter. So when selecting the aperture priority mode, by pushing this center button, this release button that's specific to the D7100 series, you don't have that same button on the D7000 series. You depress that button and you can then rotate the mode dial to whatever selection for control that you wish to operate the camera in. And in our particular case, we're going to set it for at the A, which signifies the aperture priority. You will also notice as you change that, it will appear in the LCD screen as well. And in order to change the actual aperture, if you rotate, again, wake up the camera by partially depressing the shutter release button, and then by rotating the subcommand wheel, which is at the front of the camera, and you can see that as I turn that, it's changing the aperture, which is signified by the F number that appears on the top right corner of the LCD screen. And as I turn that, you will also see that the shutter speed, the number to the left of the F number, which is your shutter speed, it will also change, and that is the camera making the selection of what it considers to be the proper reciprocal shutter speed to correspond with the aperture setting that you have selected. So in aperture priority, you're selecting the aperture or the size of the diaphragm, which controls the volume of light that enters the camera. And the camera computer is creating what it considers to be the proper reciprocal shutter speed that corresponds with that aperture setting to obtain the proper and most appealing exposure. So if you remember back to the lecture as to different circumstances and reasoning why you would want to either control the aperture or the shutter speed, to give you some circumstances or as a refresher, in aperture priority, and when you are selecting the aperture, what you are enabling to do is to either increase or decrease the amount of what the camera considers to be an acceptable focus. So if you are looking at a subject that you want to highlight within the photo, by blurring out or creating a more softened look in the background, it accentuates the subject that is the focus of what your image is supposed to be of. For scenery photography, generally you want the most acceptable focus that you can obtain, whereas if you're looking, say, at photographing a specific subject, a flower or a person, that may be your preference, is to having that in sharp focus and the background and foreground to be out of focus, to draw your eye to the subject. So in selecting the aperture, if you remember to the lecture and as a reference on the camera, it is referred to as an f-stop. So it has the F as a prefix to the number representative of what the aperture setting is. The higher the number, so for instance f22 or f32 is a very small aperture, which means the diaphragm closes down to a very small diameter, allowing less light in, but it also creates the effect of an increased amount of what is an acceptable focus for depth of field. So the smaller the aperture, which is the higher the number, will create a more acceptable focus and increase what is in focus in that frame. Likewise, by going to a lower number, you are creating the larger aperture and creating additional light, or allowing additional light to come into the camera because it's a wider opening, but it also decreases what is considered to be an acceptable focus. So if you're trying to create that image or that effect of having the focus drawn to one subject and everything else blurred, you need to lower the f-stop or the aperture setting. You lower it to a lower number, which is in effect a larger aperture.